Hey there. Tonight, let's let the world outside fall away as we step back in time together, to a place where the cold is not just a passing chill, but a relentless force that shapes every moment of life. You're about to find out how, even in the harshest winters, hope could flicker to life in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes, out of hardship and hunger, a single act of kindness or a spark of genius changed everything. So if you're the kind who loves to settle in for a gentle, immersive tale before bed, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if these calming journeys through history truly bring you comfort. And before we begin, I'd love for you to drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Imagine us all, scattered across the world, coming together beneath the same quiet sky. Now, dim your lights, get cozy, and let the warmth of the hearth and this story carry you far from the cold. Here, beside the fire, I invite you to imagine yourself not as a distant observer, but as a part of the medieval world. Picture the last leaves clinging desperately to bare branches, the sun setting early and leaving the countryside shrouded in frost. Each breath you take turns to mist, swirling in the dim light of your cottage. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the chill seep in from every corner. Outside, the fields crunch beneath a thin layer of ice, and already the first flurries of snow drift through the air, carried by a biting wind. This isn't just winter as we know it. It's a season that tests the very limits of survival. Winter in medieval Europe is not just inconvenient, it is a time of genuine danger. The cold settles in slowly at first, but once it arrives, it holds the land in its grip for months that feel eternal. With every passing day, the world grows quieter, blanketed in white. The rivers and ponds hardening into glassy sheets of ice. Imagine living in a place before central heating, insulated walls, or even glass windows, where warmth is a luxury, reserved for only the fortunate few. For most, it's a distant hope, something to dream about as you huddle close to the hearth with your family. But let's not forget, it wasn't always this way. There was a time when the winters, though harsh, followed a pattern the people understood. Seasons changed in a predictable rhythm, and even the first heavy snow was met with a kind of acceptance. Life continued, shaped by the cycles of the earth. Yet, then came a change that no one expected. The climate itself shifted, ushering in what we now call the Little Ice Age, a span from the 1300s to the 1800s, when winters grew longer, colder, and far less forgiving than any living memory could recall. No one can quite agree on what caused this deep freeze, but its effects were impossible to ignore. Crops withered in the fields, livestock struggled to survive, and the wind howled through villages with a ferocity that could chill even the bravest soul. Picture it. Years when the harvest failed, when hopes for spring faded beneath layers of unending snow, and when families gathered each evening, uncertain if their stores would last until the thaw. Perhaps one of the most striking stories from this era is the Great Frost of 1709. That winter, cold swept across Europe with such force that even the mighty Thames in London froze solid. People took to the ice, setting up stalls, roasting chestnuts, and even lighting fires right there on the river's surface. A strange, beautiful, and surreal sight. But beneath the merriment was a darker truth. The cold claimed lives in every village and city, freezing the very heart of daily existence. Many huddled in their homes, desperate for warmth, while outside, the world turned to stone. Yet, even amidst this suffering, there are glimmers of hope. Stories that remind us how the human spirit can endure. Take, for example, a young Isaac Newton. When the frost forced Cambridge to close, Newton returned to his family's farm. He found himself with long, quiet hours by the fire, time to ponder the universe while the world outside lay frozen. It was here, in the hush of winter, that he began to shape ideas that would change science forever. Moments like these, when adversity becomes the soil for brilliance, remind us that hope can spark in the most unlikely places. But for most, winter was not an opportunity. It was a daily battle. The privileged could afford thick woolen cloaks, storehouses brimming with food, and stacks of well-seasoned firewood. But the majority, peasants, serfs, and smallholders, endured a harsher reality. Let's step into their world for a moment. Imagine waking in the grey dawn, the air sharp with cold, your breath hanging in front of your face. You share a straw mattress with your family, pressed close for warmth beneath threadbare blankets. The cottage is little more than a single smoky room, the fire sputtering in the hearth, barely enough to chase away the chill. You rise carefully, not wanting to disturb the sleeping forms beside you. Your hands and feet ache from the freezing air. Your joints stiffen as you move. Breakfast, if it comes at all, is a meager affair. A bowl of watery porridge, a crust of stale bread. The stores from the last harvest are dwindling with each passing week. You know that what is left must stretch through weeks, perhaps months, before the earth gives up its bounty once more. Outside, the animals suffer too. Their breath rises in clouds within the frosty barn, their coats rimed with ice. You check on them each morning, hoping for a sign of strength, but knowing that some may not survive the season. The weight of responsibility presses on your shoulders. You gather what little firewood you can, braving the snow and wind. Your fingers crack and bleed in the cold, but you push on, knowing that without a fire, the night will bring more than discomfort. It could bring tragedy. All around you, life slows to a crawl. Days are short and labor is endless. You mend what you can, patching clothes and thatching roofs, making do with scraps and ingenuity. The rhythm of survival is relentless, each task a small act of resistance against the cold. And yet, even with hardship pressing in from every side, there are moments of light. Medieval folk were deeply attuned to the turning seasons, and even in the heart of winter, they found reasons to gather, to celebrate, to hope. The calendar was marked by rituals that drew the community together, each one a reminder that no hardship lasts forever. One such glimmer came with the feast of St. Stephen, celebrated on December the 26th. For one day, the rigid order of society could be upended. Imagine a peasant or serf crowned as the lord of misrule, presiding over a raucous celebration. For that day, laughter and song filled the air, and even the poorest shared in whatever food and drink could be spared. It was a brief escape, a moment of joy that pierced the gloom of the season. There's something powerful, isn't there, about imagining yourself amid such festivities, knowing the hunger and cold, and yet feeling the warmth of laughter, the comfort of companionship. These were not grand feasts, but simple gatherings that reminded everyone they were not alone. The darkest nights could be softened by the glow of a shared candle, a whispered story, or a pot of stew passed from neighbor to neighbor. Picture a village under a heavy blanket of snow, smoke rising from crooked chimneys, the sky a dull gray, and every footstep muffled in the drifts. Inside, families crowd together, circling the hearth, swapping tales and memories to pass the time. The food may be plain, but the company is rich. Neighbors check in on each other, carrying bundles of firewood or sharing the last of their preserved apples. There is hardship, yes, but also a fierce determination, a sense that by standing together, they might outlast the winter's worst. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the crackle of the fire, the murmur of voices, the soft weeping of a child comforted by a mother's lullaby. Each face is lined with exhaustion, but also with hope. They survived winters before, and this one too will pass. As the snow piles higher and the ice thickens, the days blend together in a quiet struggle. But always, there is the promise of spring, a hope so deeply rooted that it shapes every thought, every prayer. The people watch the horizon for the first blush of dawn that comes just a little earlier each morning. They test the earth, searching for signs that the deep freeze is loosening its grip. When the first thaw arrives, it is cause for celebration as profound as any victory. Plough Monday is one such day, a time when the community emerges from its long hibernation. The ploughs, stored and silent for months, are brought out and blessed. The ground, still hard in places, is turned over with care and reverence. Each furrow is a symbol of hope, a promise that life will return, that hunger will soon give way to abundance. There is relief, and above all, gratitude. The worst is over, and the world is waking up. Reflecting on these scenes, it's hard not to feel humbled. Today we grumble when our homes are chilly, when the wind rattles the windows, or the snow delays our morning commute. But imagine, just for a moment, what it means to face the unyielding cold day after day, year after year, without the comforts we take for granted. Our ancestors did not have the luxury of escape. They endured, and in doing so, taught us what real resilience looks like. That resilience is a legacy, a gift passed down through generations. Even in the darkest times, they found ways to come together, to share what little they had, to find joy in the smallest moments. Their strength, their hope, echoes in every story told beside the hearth. So, the next time you shiver on a cold night, or pull the covers tighter around you, pause for a moment. Remember the people who came before, their courage, their struggles, and their triumphs. Let their story remind you that even in the coldest winter, the warmth of community and the promise of renewal are never far away. And as our fire flickers low and the evening draws to a close, I want to thank you, dear listener, for joining me on this journey. If these tales of hardship and hope have touched you, please consider subscribing and sharing them with a friend. There's always room for more travelers around our hearth. And don't forget to leave a comment with your own story, or simply where and when you're listening tonight. After all, history is best shared in good company. But our exploration doesn't end here. As the brutal conditions of winter tightened their icy grip on medieval society, even the most privileged were not immune to the season's merciless onslaught. Join me next time as we look deeper into the daily realities of surviving the medieval winter through sickness, scarcity, and the unbreakable bonds of community. Until then, may the promise of spring keep you warm through the longest nights. Pull your stool a little closer to the hearth, friend, and settle in. Tonight, as the wind howls against the shutters and the frost thickens on the windows, let me take you back to those long, unyielding winters of medieval Europe, a world where the cold spared no one, regardless of status. Imagine yourself, perhaps bundled in a patched woolen cloak, the fire your only shield against the biting cold that creeps through every crack, no matter your station in life. Now, you might think the mighty stone walls of a castle would keep winter at bay, but let me tell you, those thick stones could turn as cold as a tomb. Picture a royal household as the first snows fell, a small army of servants bustling to stockpile mountains of firewood, their breath steaming in the icy air as they carried logs to fuel the great hearths. The kitchen was alive with frantic purpose. Cooks worked endlessly, preserving meat in salt, drying beans and peas, sealing away apples and cabbages in cool, dark cellars. The goal was simple: build a bulwark of food and warmth, enough to last until the world thawed again. But for all this effort, winter showed no mercy. Even noble blood offered little protection when the wind found its way through gaps and under doors. Servants stuffed rags in the windows, hammered boards across the worst drafts, and yet the chill seeped in, steady and pitiless. I can almost hear the anxious whispers in the corridors, the hush that fell as the sun dipped early below the horizon, and the firelight trembled on the walls. Let me share a story that's haunted many a winter's eve. In the winter of 1326, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary was found frozen in her own bed. Yes, within her own palace. Chroniclers say she lay still and silent, taken not by an enemy's hand, but by the cold that crept through her stone refuge. It's a chilling image, isn't it? The very walls meant to keep her safe instead became her undoing. Even the crown could not shield her from the season's brutal reach. Tales like hers cast a long shadow across the medieval winter. Death, always near, seemed to linger just outside the threshold, waiting for the fire to gutter out or the food to run short. Yet, even in the bleakest hours, people found ways to keep hope alive. One such spark came with the arrival of the Feast of St. Stephen, celebrated on December the 26th. For a day, the weight of winter lifted, if only a little, and laughter echoed through farmhouses and manor halls alike. Now, imagine yourself among the villagers as they prepared for this cherished reprieve. The feast was more than just a meal. It was a turning of the world upside down, a brief escape from the grind of daily survival. The tradition of misrule took hold, where a commoner was crowned lord of the revels for a day, granted the right to issue playful commands to his social betters. Lords and ladies, dignified on every other day, would bow and jest and share mugs of ale with peasants. For once, the rigid order of things blurred, and everyone, rich and poor, young and old, joined in the merriment. It was wild, messy, and utterly essential. In a world divided by rank, these moments of shared joy were a kind of glue, holding communities together when everything else threatened to pull them apart. The Feast of St. Stephen was a release valve for the frustration and tension that simmered under the surface of feudal life. When you think about it, perhaps you felt something like that yourself. A holiday, a gathering, a moment when everyone lets down their guard and simply enjoys being together. I'd love to hear, down in the comments, about the traditions in your own family or community that bring you warmth in the heart of winter. Do you have a feast of misrule of your own? A time when the usual order is joyfully tossed aside. But for the medieval poor, these celebrations weren't just about levity. They could mean the difference between life and death. There's a story from 1377 that's always stayed with me. Two peasant families, neighbors and friends, found their food stores nearly gone, with the promise of spring still heartbreakingly far away. On St. Stephen's Day, they pooled what little they had, some stale bread, a bit of dried meat, a few withered apples, and shared a humble meal. That act of solidarity, that stubborn refusal to let each other go hungry, gave them the strength to endure the final, grimmest stretch of winter. These small acts of kindness were the marrow of survival. When a traveler stumbled into a village, frozen and desperate, someone would offer a place by the fire and a bowl of thin pottage. When a widow's woodpile ran low, a neighbor might quietly leave an extra bundle at her door. The bonds forged in these dark days became a lifeline, a testament to the power of shared struggle. Of course, as January rolled on and the last echoes of laughter faded, winter's grip tightened once more. The Feast of St. Stephen was a brief flare in the darkness, soon swallowed by the long, hard slog that stretched through January, February, and well into March. As the days dragged by, supplies dwindled. Bellies ached. The cold pressed deeper, finding its way past even the most carefully tended fires. And yet, every year, people endured. They found reserves of strength and hope where none seemed possible. Imagine the relief, the almost disbelieving joy, when the first signs of winter's retreat began to appear. The air softening just a little, daylight lasting a bit longer, icicles dripping as the sun gained strength. After months of struggle, these were miracles, pure and simple. For those who worked the land, there was no day more eagerly awaited than Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany in early January. It marked the ritual beginning of the new agricultural year, a signal that the frozen fields would soon yield to the plough once more. I can see it now. The village men and boys hauling their ploughs to the church to be blessed, the teams of oxen pawing the thawing earth, everyone's breath clouding in the cold morning air. Each furrow they turned was a victory, a sign that winter's reign was ending, that life would return. It's hard for us now, wrapped in the comfort of central heating and well-stocked shelves, to really grasp what it meant to live through such a winter. Our hardships seem minor in comparison. The next time your commute is slowed by snow, or you grumble about shoveling the driveway, try to picture what it was like to face a world where the cold could kill, and a missed harvest meant months of hunger. Yet, the resilience of those who came before us is something we can still draw on. Their ability to find moments of celebration, to lift each other up, even as the world outside froze and darkened, was nothing short of remarkable. So, as you tuck yourself into your warm bed tonight, give a thought to the men and women who faced winter's siege with nothing but courage, community, and hope to see them through. Their spirit, tested, tempered, and never broken, lives on in all of us. As the new year wore on and the brief joy of plough Monday faded, daily life in the medieval winter settled back into its harsh, familiar rhythm. The days remained bitterly short, and the nights stretched on, cold and silent. If you were fortunate, you'd find shelter in a smoky cottage, or perhaps a draughty manor, and you'd huddle close to the embers, grateful for any warmth. But for many, especially those with little to their names, every day was a fight against the elements. The greatest danger, aside from hunger and cold, was sickness. The cramped, unsanitary conditions of the time were a perfect breeding ground for illness. A simple cold could leave you miserable, with red nose and watery eyes, but far worse lurked in the shadows. Influenza was a dreaded visitor. With no vaccines or real medicines, the flu could sweep through a town like wildfire, striking down the young, the old, and everyone in between. The winter of 1557 was especially harsh. Imagine Paris mourning over 10,000 lost souls in a single season. In those days, a fever was not just uncomfortable, it was terrifying. Pneumonia was another relentless killer, often preying on those already weakened by cold and hunger. The dampness of winter seeped into lungs, turning a simple cough into a death sentence. It was not uncommon for entire families to fall ill, and for children to be left orphaned. Even the privileged weren't safe. Royal courts, always bustling with visitors and dignitaries, were perfect places for disease to spread. One need only recall the tragedy of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's beloved wife, who died from complications likely worsened by the poor hygiene of the age. No amount of status could keep sickness at bay. Children suffered the most. Born in the depths of winter, they faced a gauntlet of dangers from birth. In 16th century London, half of all children never lived to see their 5th birthday. There's a custom from that time that breaks the heart. A black ribbon would be tied to the hand of a gravely ill infant. If the child passed, it became the tie for their burial shroud, a silent witness to winter's toll on the innocent. Winter became a time to seal up the home and pray for safety, a time when even simple comforts were anything but guaranteed. For the poorest, firewood was a luxury, tightly regulated by law and jealously guarded by the landowners. Imagine huddling around a meager fire fueled by dried dung and straw, the warmth barely enough to keep frostbite at bay. Livestock, if you had any, crowded into the same space, their bodies adding what little heat they could muster. Each breath hung in the air, mingling human and animal alike. Food was another daily worry. By January or February, the bounty of autumn was a fading memory. The diet narrowed to salted meat, dried peas, and the last coarse loaves of bread. If you were lucky, you might find some wild onions or garlic, maybe a handful of nettles or mushrooms gathered from the woods. Picture the evening meal, a bubbling pot of pottage, filled with whatever could be scrounged: beans, bits of salted pork, the odd green from foraging. There was little variety and even less flavor. but it was enough to keep body and soul together until the world thawed. For many, even this was a distant dream. A poor harvest or a rash of storms could mean true disaster. And disasters did come. The Great Famine of 1315 stands out in the chronicles, a time when relentless rains drowned the crops and hunger swept across the land. The stories from those years are haunting. Desperate villagers eating whatever they could find, dogs, horses, and, in the most terrible accounts, even turning on each other. Some parents, it said, smothered their starving children to spare them a slower death. Fields and streets filled with bodies, far too many for proper burials. While the scale of that famine was exceptional, smaller shortages and local crises were a constant threat. Every winter, every spring, brought the same fear: would there be enough to last? It's sobering to think how close to the edge so many lived year after year. Their daily meals balanced on a knife's edge between subsistence and starvation. The months between the last autumn harvest and the first green shoots were a time of endurance and often of suffering. Yet, in spite of it all, they persisted. Each winter was a test, and each spring a triumph. When you compare these struggles to the relative ease of our modern lives, a warm bed, a full pantry, a world where illness rarely sweeps away whole families, it's easy to forget just how much we owe to the resilience of those who came before. The next time you wrap a blanket around your shoulders, or pour a hot drink to ward off the chill, pause for a moment. Think of the countless generations who survived by the strength of their communities, the warmth of shared fires, and the stubborn hope that spring would come again. Now, as the fire dies down and our story turns towards the dawn of a new season, remember that winter was never just about surviving the cold. It shaped every part of medieval life, faith, ritual, and the ways people found meaning in the struggle. So, let's stoke the embers a little and look ahead. Beyond basic survival, winter affected every facet of medieval culture. The way people endured, the rituals they built, and the spirit they carried, these are tales worth telling. Join me by the hearth for the next chapter, where we'll explore the resilience, ritual, and triumph of the human spirit in the heart of the medieval winter. Now, friend, pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Let the warmth soak into your bones as I pour you another mug of spiced ale. This is a good night for stories. Stories of resilience, ritual, and the triumph of the human spirit in the heart of medieval winter. Out there beyond these thick stone walls, the world is rhymed with frost, cold and silent. But here, in the glow of the hearth, you can almost forget how fierce the wind bites. Almost. You see, winter was more than just a season of survival. It pressed its mark into the very culture and rhythm of medieval life. Even the simplest pleasures and pastimes bent to the will of the cold. The snow and the endless dark changed not just how people lived, but how they found joy, worshipped, and even how they faced justice. There's a certain heaviness to the air in winter, a weight that presses folks inward toward each other. The laughter and noise of the Yule feast fade, and in their place, quieter evenings settle in. Travel is too dangerous, roads little more than frozen ruts, so people stay close to home. In the evenings, the world shrinks to a single room, lit by the soft glow of rushlights and the gentle flicker of tallow candles. You might imagine yourself there, huddled with your kin, the sound of the wind rattling the shutters. Someone pulls out a bit of sewing, another sets to weaving, and a third whittles at a scrap of wood, shaping something new from winter's gift of time. Idleness is frowned upon, so everyone keeps their hands busy. But all this work is woven through with song and story. Picture it. The storyteller's voice rising and falling as the children's eyes widen, tales of clever tricksters and noble knights swirling through the smoky air. Maybe you join in, sharing a song you learned from your grandmother, or listening to the oldest tales passed down, like family heirlooms. For those who could read, winter was a rare opportunity. Books weren't for everyone. Most humble folk might own a single precious volume. A tradesman's shelf might hold a battered Bible or a book of hours, and, if he was lucky, a collection of merry stories about Robin Hood or King Arthur. The real treasure, though, was in reading aloud, letting the words knit the family together while the winds howled outside. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They were a lifeline, a way to escape the tight confines of stone and thatch, to wander through forests and courts and far-off lands, all from the safety of the hearth. You can almost feel how these tales must have lifted spirits, pulling everyone out of the drudgery and into the world of imagination, if only for an evening. But not every diversion was quite so wholesome. With days so short and nights so long, temptations crept in. Dice rattled across wooden tables, bones and coins clattering, as fortunes changed hands in an instant. Picture a smoky tavern, the air thick with laughter and the occasional curse as someone's luck soured. Gambling was a favorite winter pastime, and it was as likely to end in a burst of laughter as in a heated argument. Ale, mead, and wine flowed, warming frozen fingers and loosening tongues. In these rowdy gatherings, stories turned bawdy, debates flared, and, every so often, tempers boiled over into a scuffle. Even so, these moments were a kind of release, a way to shake off winter's gloom and remember that, for all its hardships, life still held pleasure. Still, not every winter night was filled with merriment. The season also offered the quiet gift of reflection. The church's influence grew even stronger during these months. With fields lying fallow and little work to be done outside, people turned inward toward faith, prayer, and the hope of something greater. Hushed churches glimmered with candlelight, and the faithful whispered prayers, cold fingers tracing rosary beads as they sought comfort and guidance. Some, driven by deep devotion, would even set out on winter pilgrimages, braving the ice and snow to prove their faith. Charity, too, was a winter virtue. In a season of want, the smallest acts of kindness became lifelines. The church taught that there were 7 acts of mercy: feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned, comfort the sick, and bury the dead. Imagine yourself, perhaps, bringing a spare loaf of bread to a neighbor whose stores had run low, or sharing a blanket with someone shivering in the cold. These gestures, simple as they seem, were acts of resilience, a stubborn refusal to let winter win. Yet the cold could also bring out the darker side of human nature. When food ran short and spirits wore thin, desperation sometimes bubbled over. Crime tended to rise with the snow. The close quarters of winter living meant tempers flared, and petty theft or heated arguments could quickly turn into violence. The justice system, such as it was, often struggled to keep up. Trials were postponed until the thaw, so the accused languished in damp, crowded jails, waiting for judgment. Punishments, when they came, could be severe. Fines, floggings, and even public executions were meted out to those who crossed the line. Still, even in these grim moments, the community found ways to keep moving forward, holding fast to a sense of order and hope. Even as the nights seemed endless, people searched for reasons to celebrate. There is something almost defiant about the way medieval folk clung to small joys. One of the brightest sparks in the heart of winter was the feast of St. Valentine, celebrated on the 14th of February. What began as a pagan festival for fertility was transformed into a Christian day for lovers, and by the 15th century it had become a cherished tradition. Imagine the excitement as young men and women gathered in a neighbor's cottage, cheeks flushed with anticipation and cold. They would drop slips of paper with their names into a bowl, each hoping to draw the name of a sweetheart. This simple ritual set the tone for a year of courtship, flirtation, and sometimes new marriages. Flowers, sweets, and carefully crafted verses were exchanged as tokens of affection. Even a handmade card could make a heart race. Doesn't that sound familiar? In those moments, even the deepest frost could do nothing to freeze the warmth of love. As February wore on, and the last of the Valentine celebrations faded, another season crept in, Lent. The days of feasting and flirtation gave way to somber reflection and self-denial. But beneath the surface, there was a sense that spring was drawing near. The first snowdrops and crocuses poked their heads through the frozen ground, whispering that winter's strength was finally waning. These tiny bursts of green were more than just plants. They were symbols of hope, proof that the world would soon awaken. Throughout the Middle Ages, winter was the great equalizer. It tested everyone, from the highest lord to the humblest peasant. Just surviving was an act of courage. But winter also brought out the best in people, a quiet strength, a sense of community, and the stubborn belief that better days would come. The cold, the hunger, the biting winds, they forged a resilience that runs deep in our blood. Next time you grumble about a late train, or curse the slush under your boots, spare a thought for those who came before us. They braved the wind without heavy coats, managed without central heat or weather forecasts, and still found ways to laugh, to love, and to hope. You, sitting here by the fire, are the heir to their grit and their creativity. If you have a warm bed and a full belly tonight, thank those medieval survivors for lighting the path. So, as you finish your drink and the embers glow low, let your dreams wander to snow-dusted fields and the comfort of shared stories. May you wake tomorrow with gratitude for the warmth that surrounds you, and a little more admiration for the resilience that carried people through winters long past. Now, as the last logs settle into glowing coals, let's turn our attention to what daily life looked like for those hardy souls, stepping out each morning into the cold. Pull your stool closer to the fire, friend, and let me tell you how winter pressed its icy thumbprint on every life in medieval Europe. Picture a morning when the pale, feeble sun barely manages to brighten the pewter sky. You feel the cold even here beside the hearth. So imagine what it was like out there, where the wind prowled through the bare trees and slipped like a thief beneath every door and window. The poorest in the village, your neighbors, your family, clutched thin, stretchy woolen cloaks around themselves. The same wool that made them sweat and itch when the fields burned with summer heat. Now, it seemed almost laughable. This meager barrier that did so little to hold back the biting, relentless cold. You'd huddle shoulder to shoulder inside your smoky, cramped hut, watching your breath rise and swirl in the dimness, grateful at least for the company and the small warmth of shared bodies. Winter spared no creature. The old workhorse, bones sharp beneath his tangled winter coat, stood in the gloom of the byre, chewing thoughtfully on a sparse handful of hay, remembering the sweet, thick grass of seasons past. And the milk cow, her sides heaving with every chilly draught, let out a low, mournful bellow that seemed to echo the hunger and discomfort in every corner of the farm. Even the barn cats, usually so aloof and smug, prowled with less swagger, their bellies pinched and their whiskers tipped with frost, casting longing looks at the kitchen door in hopes of a scrap. Life at the bottom of the ladder was hard, yes, but don't think the winter left the noble halls untouched. If you found yourself in a castle, you'd quickly discover that stone walls are poor companions in the cold. The grand ladies wrapped themselves in layer upon layer of costly silk and fine fur, but still the chill seeped through, making them shiver as they paced the echoing corridors. In the kitchens, cooks and scullions wrestled desperately with pots of stew and hunks of bread, trying to produce enough hot food to keep the noble bellies satisfied and the tempers from flaring. There's a story told about King Henry II, who once grew so tired of the winter cold that he ordered an entire chair tossed into the fire, just to feel a moment's blessed warmth on his royal backside. You can almost hear the muttering of his servants, anxious that the king's temper would blaze hotter than the flames if the chill wasn't chased away soon enough. No matter whether you wore a peasant's patched tunic or a lord's velvet, Winter was a test of patience and spirit. The days stretched on, grey and monotonous, broken only by the rare shining islands of festivity. On those precious feast days, the whole village seemed to breathe a little easier. Laughter and music spilled into the night, and the weight of winter lifted, if only for a few hours. Take the feast of St. Stephen, the day after Christmas, when joy and mischief tumbled side by side. It was a time for merry rebellion, when tradition allowed a lowly peasant to be crowned the Lord of Misrule. For one magical day, the usual order of things was turned on its head. Imagine the scene: the poorest villager, head held high, barking out mock orders to the local baron, who was forced to obey with a painted-on grin. The hall rang with real, hearty laughter, the kind that warms you from the inside out, as nobles fetched ale for their tenants, and everyone, high and low, feasted together as equals. For a brief time, the cold was forgotten, replaced by the glow of human connection and the sweet taste of freedom. But as quickly as the revelry began, it faded. The Lord of Misrule stepped down, the barons reclaimed their dignity, and the peasants returned to their daily toil. The darkness and the wind crept back into every crevice. You'd find yourself trudging home through the snow, cheeks stinging, hands numb, the echoes of laughter fading behind you. Yet these moments of shared joy lingered, a stubborn ember in the heart that refused to be snuffed out by cold or hardship. And there were other fires too, quieter but no less vital. In the hush after the festivities, when the wind howled and the world seemed carved from ice, it was kindness that made survival possible. Neighbors shared what little they had, quietly slipping a loaf of bread or a bundle of firewood to those in greater need. There's an old tale from York about Dame Matilda, who once gave her only cloak to a shivering beggar woman. She walked home through the snow with the cold chewing at her bones, and when someone asked her why she'd risk her own comfort, she only smiled and said, "Kindness is a fire no winter wind can put out." That's the heart of it, friend, the secret weapon against the long, hard season. Every small act of generosity, every shared story or song, was another stone in the foundation of resilience. Winter could freeze your toes and numb your fingers, but it couldn't reach the warmth you kept alive in your chest. No matter how merciless the weather, the people endured. They pressed on, bolstered by the hope of spring and the knowledge that even the longest winter would eventually end. If you listen closely, you might hear a lesson whispered in the snow outside your window tonight. We, with our thick blankets and glowing hearths, owe much to those who came before us, those who braved the cold with little more than stubbornness and the strength of community. Their courage in the face of hardship is a legacy that still warms us, if we let it. So, as you nestle deeper into your own comforts, take a moment to reflect. Could you have weathered those long, dark months? Or would you have found yourself searching for warmth in laughter and fellowship, just as they did? I invite you to share your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a winter that tested you, or found unexpected joy in simple company? Let's keep these stories alive together, forging our own community to match the resilience of those ancient winters. And now, as the snowdrifts begin to soften and hope stirs in the still frozen earth, let's turn our gaze to what comes next. For just beyond the reach of winter's grip, something miraculous is stirring. Spring, at last. Can you feel it, friend? Here in our humble inn, the fire crackles a little less fiercely, and the draught beneath the door seems more forgiving. Picture yourself stepping outside after so many months huddled by smoky hearths, the world still glazed with the memory of frost. The air carries a different promise now. The long, merciless winter that clung to the land with icy fingers is finally releasing its hold, and you, like every soul in the village, are aching to greet the change. After surviving months of bitter cold, cramped together in cottages, bellies rumbling with hunger, spirits tested by the endless dark, spring feels almost miraculous. Each day, The sun lingers a little longer, its golden light glancing off patches of receding snow and sparkling on puddles where ice has surrendered. Imagine yourself blinking in the brightness, your eyes adjusting to a world suddenly reborn. You're not alone in this. All around, neighbors emerge from their winter dens, shoulders straightening, faces lifting toward the warmth they've craved for so long. Children are the first to burst free, their laughter ringing out like birdsong. They tumble into the muddy lanes, splashing through the thawing earth, their cheeks flushed with the kind of joy only the young or the newly liberated can know. Look closer, and you'll see them kneeling in the cold, damp grass, eyes wide at the sight of the season's first bold flowers, crocuses and snowdrops, tiny miracles pushing through the softened ground. There's no time to waste. Out in the fields, the farmers gather, talking in animated bursts, their voices brimming with anticipation. Plough. Monday is almost upon them, the first Monday after Epiphany, when tradition declares the earth ready for the year's first furrows. Feel the excitement as draught horses and sturdy oxen are led from their stalls, their manes braided with ribbons, garlands draped round their necks. The whole village turns out to watch, as the animals parade down the main street, bells tied to harnesses chiming with every step. The church bells join in, their peals soaring above the rooftops, a jubilant signal that the hardest season has passed. You can sense the collective sigh of relief. Chimneys once choked by ice now exhale gentle plumes of smoke, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the first hopeful simmering of spring stews. The sharp edge of fear, of frostbite, of illness, of running out of food, softens with the melting snow. Faces once drawn with worry begin to relax, lips curling into genuine, grateful smiles. There's a new energy in every footstep, a lightness that comes from knowing you made it through. Soon, the larders will fill with color and flavor again. Greens from the garden, plump berries, the first fresh eggs of the year. For months you survived on tough bread, salted meat, and hard cheese that barely held off hunger. Now, the prospect of leafy vegetables and sweet fruit feels like a feast for the senses. If you close your eyes and imagine it, you might realize just how momentous this change was for those who came before us. Today, maybe you complain about muddy boots or the nuisance of losing an hour of sleep when the clocks change. But for our medieval ancestors, spring's arrival meant life itself. It was proof that, despite winter's harshest tests, they had prevailed. The bare, skeletal trees donning new leaves mirrored the regrowth felt deep within the heart, a renewal of hope and spirit. You can still hear echoes of that joy in ancient songs and stories. There's a centuries-old English tune that captures the giddy, irrepressible celebration of spring's return. Its words, rough but heartfelt, call out, "Sing cuckoo." The seed is growing, the meadow is blooming, the woods are springing anew. The melody bounces along, brimming with laughter and gratitude, and you can almost see villagers linking arms, dancing on the village green, their worries washed away by sunlight and song. Let's pause for a moment and honor that resilience, that zest for life. Through the harshest nights and leanest meals, medieval people clung to each other and to hope. They survived not just through grit and stubbornness, but thanks to the strength of their communities. The neighbor who shared a loaf of bread, the family who opened their door to the cold and lonely. And when the sun finally broke through, they didn't just endure, they rejoiced, savoring every birdsong and warm breeze as a hard-won triumph over nature's cruelty. As you settle deeper into your chair by my fire, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those who came before us. Think of the relief in their hearts as they flung open the shutters and let the spring air sweep through the house. Think of the pride and gratitude as they stepped into the mud, not cursing it, but welcoming it as a sign that life was beginning anew. Their tenacity and joy, forged by hardship, should humble and inspire us. Whenever you face your own bleak seasons, whether in the cold outside your window or in the struggles of your daily life, Remember how they emerged from winter's grasp with hope intact. If they could greet the dawn of spring with such exuberance, surely we too can find our own reasons to rejoice, our own wellsprings of hope. And so, as the thaw arrives and the songbirds return, remember, the sun always comes back, and we each get another chance to step into the light. Now, as you finish your cup and the fire burns low, let's think together about what comes next, for the story of winter's survival is not yet over. The blizzards and bitter frosts continue to torment the land. Icy winds howled through every crevice, snow piled against thatched roofs, and the world outside seemed locked in a frozen grip. Yet, in the heart of every medieval village, a stubborn kind of hope flickered. You could see it in the way people clung together, refusing to let the cold and darkness win. Even as hunger gnawed and frost nipped at fingers and toes, neighbors rallied around one another, turning hardship into a shared struggle that no one faced alone. Picture yourself, bundled in a rough woolen cloak, the scent of wood smoke clinging to your hair as you join your neighbors in a dim, firelit cottage. Food is scarce, that's true, but what little there is gets shared. Tonight, it's a communal meal, a bubbling pot of vegetable pottage, and a few precious slices of bread, passed from hand to hand. Each household takes a turn hosting, offering up what they can spare, no matter how meager. In these moments, the warmth of company does as much to stave off winter's bite as the fire itself. But it wasn't just the able-bodied who found comfort in these gatherings. In every village, there were always those who struggled more than most. Old Agnes comes to mind. She lived alone at the edge of the green, her back bent and hands gnarled by years of labor. With no family left, Agnes faced the winter with dread. Her bones ached from the cold, and some nights she could barely coax a spark from her flint. One evening, when the sky was the color of slate and the wind shrieked around her door, Agnes sat shivering, convinced she would not last the week. Then came a sudden knock. She shuffled to the door, expecting the wind to greet her, but instead found young Tom, the miller's son, his cheeks flushed red and arms loaded with gifts. He brought her a sack of dried peas, a hunk of salted pork, and, most precious of all, an armful of firewood. The food had come from neighbors who had even less to spare, and Tom had trudged through knee-deep snow to bring it all to her. As Tom knelt to build a fire in her hearth, the flames slowly taking hold, Agnes watched with tears streaming down her face. She hadn't felt warmth like that in weeks. For the first time in ages, hope crept back into her heart. And if you'd been there, sitting beside Agnes's hearth, you'd feel a part of that moment too, a reminder of how even the smallest kindness could change a life. Stories like Agnes's weren't rare. All across the countryside, village folk watched over the vulnerable. Young men were assigned to check on widows and the sick, making sure no one went too many days without firewood or a hot meal. In these bleak months, compassion became as important as bread. Yet, it wasn't only the poor who learned the value of giving. Even the wealthy, those living behind thick stone walls and sleeping under heavy furs, were touched by the suffering around them. Lady Margaret, the Earl's wife, was well known for her acts of charity each winter. Her home was a grand castle, with larders stocked for the season. She could have turned away from the troubles of the peasantry, as many of her noble friends did. Some of them even mocked her, asking why she would waste good food on mere peasants, who, in their eyes, counted for little more than the livestock in the fields. But Lady Margaret's heart was set on a different path. She believed deeply in her duty to care for those less fortunate. When famine struck during one especially brutal winter, she ordered her stewards to stretch the castle's supplies as far as possible. Cooks were told to thicken stews with every last root vegetable, turning out bucket after bucket of hearty soup for the hungry who came knocking at the gates. The castle's kitchen became as busy as a marketplace, echoing with the sounds of chopping, stirring, and the grumbling of kitchen boys pressed into extra work. Bernard, the head cook, a round-bellied man with a booming laugh, didn't complain. He took pride in the challenge, pouring every scrap of turnip, every shriveled potato, into the bubbling cauldrons. The resulting soup was sometimes thin and gristly, with only a few scraps of mutton floating on top. But to the starving, it was a feast. You can almost picture the line of peasants, hands wrapped around steaming bowls, grateful for the warmth and sustenance, even if it would be their only meal for days. As the winter dragged on, even Lady Margaret's generous stores began to dwindle. Unwilling to let her people starve, she quietly parted with some of her jewelry, trading it in distant towns for more sacks of grain and barrels of salted meat. Her husband, the Earl, watched her efforts with a mixture of pride and worry. He respected her faith and her sense of duty, though he fretted about what would happen if another hard winter came too soon. The church, too, played a vital role in helping those battered by winter's hand. Monasteries became sanctuaries for the poor and the sick, their doors flung open to welcome all who sought refuge. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the low hum of prayer, but also with the less pleasant odors of illness and too many people crammed into tight quarters. Still, the monks did what they could. They offered straw pallets for sleeping, simple bread and ale for nourishment, and, in some places, even rudimentary care for the ill. Brother William, a novice only just learning the ways of his order, was put in charge of the monastery's hospital wing. The work was grim, scraping icy water from the well to wash wounds, spooning broth into mouths that could barely swallow, and tending to sores that would not heal. The sights and smells could turn even the strongest stomach. But William pressed on, praying for strength as he changed bandages and whispered words of comfort. He knew, deep down, that it was only luck and his calling that kept him from sharing the fate of those he cared for. Winter was a great leveler. No matter your birth or your wealth, the cold found its way in. The rich could wrap themselves in thick woolen stockings and sip mulled wine, but even their grand halls were draughty and their stores not limitless. And when illness swept through the land, it claimed highborn and lowborn alike. Lady Isabel, a noblewoman of delicate grace, was heavy with child during one especially bitter cold snap. She spent her days in a chamber lined with furs, tended by a flock of maids, every comfort provided. Yet, sickness crept in quietly, brought by a kitchen girl with a harsh cough, who offered Lady Isabel a mug of warm milk and herbs. Within days, fever gripped the noblewoman, her breathing ragged and weak. The child arrived too soon, fragile as a snowflake, and never drew breath. By the week's end, Lady Isabel herself had slipped away, lost to the same winter that threatened the poorest in her husband's lands. Not even the king escaped the reach of winter. King Henry, known for his gentle and pious nature, spent long nights staring into the flames, plagued by worry for his suffering people. His physicians brewed expensive tonics of cinnamon and ginger, hoping to chase away the cold and gloom. Still, the chill settled deep into his bones, and a heavy sadness crept into his spirit. Some courtiers whispered that the king's melancholy was a sign of divine disfavor. But those who truly understood knew that no one, not even a king, was safe from the weight of winter's darkness. And yet, as the days slowly stretched longer and the icy grip of deep winter began to relax, hope stirred again. People dared to believe in spring. They watched the horizon for the first traces of gold in the morning sky, felt the ground soften under their boots, and counted the days until the earth would awaken. The start of spring was marked by a joyful tradition, Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany. On this day, the village men would blacken their faces with soot for good luck, then parade through the muddy lanes, hauling their ploughshare high. The singing and laughter echoed through the air, a riot of sound meant to wake the sleeping soil. Afterward, there would be dancing, hearty food, and mugs of ale passed from hand to hand. It was a promise that the worst had passed, and brighter days waited just beyond the thaw. This cycle of suffering and renewal played out everywhere, from the smallest craft to the grandest castle. In noble halls, minstrels struck up lively tunes and noble couples danced with new vigor, celebrating the hope a new year brought. In the king's palace, feasts were thrown, tables groaning with roasted swan and honeyed treats. Even the peasant Giles, tired but undaunted, felt the weight of winter lift as he stepped out into the pale sun, clutching a pouch of seeds that meant the difference between hunger and plenty. And what of old Agnes? The same woman who had nearly given in to despair now stood by her hearth, stirring a pot of pottage, humming softly to herself. She had survived the season's harshest tests and lived to welcome spring's return. In her survival you can see the miracle of endurance, the way a community's compassion can bring someone through even the bleakest winter. Winter in the medieval world was brutal, make no mistake. It brought hunger, cold, and the ever-present shadow of death. But it also revealed what truly mattered, the bonds between people, the strength found in generosity, and the unbreakable thread of hope that pulled everyone toward the future. When faced with darkness, medieval folk answered with kindness, grit, and a defiant sense of celebration. So, as you tuck yourself beneath a warm blanket, maybe grumbling about heating bills, or scraping ice from your car windshield, spare a moment for those who came before us. Reflect on how medieval people survived winter after winter, without the comforts we take for granted. No electric blankets, no central heating, no supermarket shelves piled high. Our winter troubles, however daunting they seem, are nothing compared to theirs. And perhaps, in remembering their example, we can learn something valuable. That when life turns cold and difficult, the best way through is together, with empathy, with charity, and with the stubborn hope that spring will come again. No matter how deep the snow, or how long the night, the sun always rises in the end. Now, as the fire crackles low and you draw closer to the warmth, let your mind wander to that first promise of spring. The harshness of winter makes the return of life and light all the sweeter, and as any wise king might say, let us winter bravely, so we may spring eternally. Let your imagination linger a little longer, because in our next chapter, we'll walk with you into the biting morning air, where survival, suffering, and the tiniest joys of medieval winter await. Come now, warm yourself by the fire, and let me tell you how the world truly looked when winter ruled these lands. Imagine the crunch of frost beneath your worn boots as you trudge through deep snowdrifts, your breath hanging in the air like tiny ghosts. Sunlight glimmers on icicles that dangle from the thatched eaves of rough-hewn huts, each one a fragile dagger waiting for the next thaw. The village, wrapped in a hush, seems to huddle together, bracing itself against the relentless cold. This is the medieval winter your ancestors knew, and it was no festive painting. We love to picture those olden days as endless feasts in warm castles, laughter ringing out beneath holly garlands, everyone rosy-cheeked and content. But the truth. For most folk, winter was a season of gnawing hunger, aching cold, and the daily grind of survival. The shadow of famine crept ever closer with each day. The ground stayed frozen. Fields lay barren, livestock thinned to skin and bone, and the stores of grain shrank with every meager meal. Sometimes, all that was left between a family and starvation were bitter roots, shriveled turnips, or a handful of dried beans. Let me share with you a winter that haunts the records. A cold, merciless stretch in 1315. Storms battered the English countryside, and the harvest failed by a third. People grew so desperate, they boiled strips of leather from their own shoes just to fill their bellies. Some even tore the straw from their cottage roofs and tried to make it edible, all while forced to labor on the Lord's land. That sort of hunger sank deep into the bones, and it didn't take much for illness to set in. Malnutrition was a silent enemy. When your body is worn down and empty, the smallest cold can grow into something deadly. Influenza and fever swept through villages like a scythe, claiming the young and the old alike. Imagine the scene. Families pressed close together, packing into the dim warmth of a single smoky room, every breath shared, every cough echoing in the stale air. It might sound cozy at first, but the reality was far from it. The scent of unwashed bodies, damp rushes, and overflowing chamber pots mixed with the smoke from the hearth, turning these shelters into breeding grounds for disease. There's a tale from 14th century Suffolk, where 13 souls, grandparents, babes in arms, even the family's scrawny chickens and half-wild dogs, all spent the winter crowded into a single-room cottage. The air grew thick, and the walls seemed to close in, but the alternative was far worse. To sleep outside was to risk freezing before dawn. It's a wonder anyone survived to see the spring. But illness and hunger weren't the only threats in the dark months. Fire, too, stalked the city streets and village lanes. With houses packed tight and built of wood, a single spark could unleash disaster. There was the Great Fire of London in 1212. It started on a freezing November night, the wind howling through the city's narrow alleys. The flames spread so quickly that thousands of Londoners, huddled together for warmth, perished as water froze in the pipes and escape routes vanished in smoke and chaos. In the blink of an eye, the cold became the least of their worries. And then there was the peril of travel. Forget the idea of a picturesque winter journey. Roads vanished beneath ice and slush, and blizzards could erase the landscape altogether. With daylight already in short supply, travelers who lost their way might wander in circles until exhaustion claimed them. In 1311, Queen Isabella herself discovered this the hard way. She set out from Canterbury for London just as dusk fell. The snow blinded her party, and they lost the road entirely. Imagine her, the most powerful woman in the land, reduced to tears of fear and weariness, stumbling through the night, not knowing if morning would ever come. Even the animals, those silent partners in survival, suffered under winter's hand. Horses and oxen grew gaunt from lack of feed, their breath steaming as they strained to pull carts through snow that reached their knees. Frostbite turned ears and tails black, and hooves cracked from the frozen ground. Sometimes, the wheels themselves would shatter, splintered by the bitter cold. Yet, even in all this hardship, the spark of hope refused to die. There were moments, small, flickering, precious moments, when people found light in the darkness. The Feast of St. Stephen, which we now call Boxing Day, was one such time. Churches overflowed with gifts for the poor, and the wealthy opened their halls to share a warm meal with the hungry. Laughter echoed in the cold as the Lord of Misrule, a lowly peasant or a cheeky young deacon, was crowned king for a day, presiding over a riot of jokes, songs, and harmless mischief. For a brief spell, the world turned upside down, and even the poorest could taste a bit of joy. Through it all, hope survived, etched in every frosty breath, whispered in every prayer that spring would come, that food would hold out, that the sun would return to chase away the darkness yet again. So, next time you grumble about shoveling snow, curse your stubborn thermostat, or shiver at a bus stop, spare a thought for those who came before us. Our medieval kin faced winters of hardship that most of us can barely imagine, and yet, year after year, they endured. Their quiet courage in the face of winter's cruelty is a lesson passed down through time, even if their names have faded from memory. We owe them a moment of reflection, and, perhaps, a bit of gratitude for the strength woven deep into our shared story. And as you sit here, safe in the warmth of our hearth, let's look ahead together. For winter's grip is not yet finished. In the next part of our tale, we'll see how famine and even the threat of war tested every last ounce of resilience. The bitter frost continued its icy reign, transforming the landscape into a crystalline wonderland, that would be picturesque, if not for the immense hardship it inflicted on the inhabitants of the land. You can almost hear the winter wind howling outside these walls, can't you? Picture it. The world beyond our firelit inn is locked in the grip of a relentless medieval winter. What appears to be a glistening fairy tale landscape. Branches coated in ice, fields sparkling under the pale sun, was, for the people living here centuries ago, a season marked far more by hardship than by beauty. The snow would fall day after day, heavy and ceaseless, smothering the countryside beneath a thick, suffocating white blanket. If you step outside in your mind's eye, you'll see icicles dangling from every rooftop, glittering in the weak daylight like a row of knives. Inside, the hearths blaze with what little wood can be spared, but even that warmth only goes so far. The smoky air is thick, stinging your eyes and scratching at your throat. The smell of burning peat mingling with the close scent of bodies pressed together for warmth. In the cramped huts of peasants, family and livestock alike, huddle side by side, the pungent mix of animal dung and unwashed skin forming a smell that's impossible to forget. There's a strange comfort in crowding together, but for many, even this is a blessing out of reach. Imagine sitting now, sharing a wooden bowl of thin, watery gruel, each spoonful stretching out the precious stores of grain. Hunger gnaws at your belly, a constant companion, and you count every bite, hoping it lasts until the first green shoots of spring. Even the nobility, tucked away in drafty stone castles that seem to drink in the cold and breathe out a damp chill, aren't spared. Their tapestries and thick furs offer only the illusion of comfort. Vast stores of firewood and food are needed to survive the months of frost, and a careless or unlucky lord might find his household just as vulnerable as any peasant's. There's a story I often share by the fire, one that always makes my guests shiver. A Bohemian princess, wrapped in velvet and furs, still froze to death in her own bedchamber during a particularly brutal winter. Her fate is a stark reminder that not even a crown could shield you from winter's bite. But for the common folk, the loss of a loved one to the cold was heartbreakingly ordinary. Each death was a quiet tragedy, a family's grief swallowed by the cold and the snow. As if hunger and cold weren't enough, disease flourished in winter's shadow. Fevers and coughs swept through villages where people lived cheek by jowl, weakened by hunger and breathing air, thick with smoke and filth. The so-called remedies of the time, herbs, charms, prayers, offered little comfort, and the healers themselves often stood helpless of the sickbed. You can almost feel the tension in those crowded rooms, hope flickering with every ragged breath. And then there were the roads, if you could even call them that. Deep drifts and treacherous ice made travel a dangerous gamble. Only the truly desperate would risk the journey, maybe a merchant with a cart full of dwindling wares, or a lone villager searching for a healer. Most stayed put, watching supplies run out and news trickle in only when the weather allowed. Even the powerful suffered. Taxes and tithes went uncollected, much to the annoyance of lords and priests counting empty coffers. Yet sometimes, in the heart of this hardship, history took a dramatic turn. Picture a Welsh mountain pass in 1407, the wind shrieking, snow blinding, and an army struggling through chest-deep drifts. The Welsh rebel leader, Owain Glyndwr, faced the future King Henry V's larger forces, but winter was on Glyndwr's side. His men, hardened by years of harsh weather, lured the English into a blizzard so fierce it became another weapon. The English, weighed down by their armor and chilled to the bone, broke ranks and fled, many never making it out of the mountains. That victory, won as much by frost as by sword, became legendary, a tale we still tell when the wind howls and the snow piles high. So, as you sit here by my fire, perhaps sipping something warm, take a moment to imagine yourself in those times. Would you have found the courage to endure, or the cleverness to survive? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm always eager to hear your stories and reflections. But as harsh as these winters were, The true terror for many came, not just from the cold, but from the hunger and sickness that so often followed. Next, we'll step into a world where famine and disease cast even darker shadows. Come, take your seat by the fire, and let me tell you, friend, about the true shadow that haunted the winters of medieval Europe. Here, in this old inn, we know the comfort of a warm hearth and a hearty meal. But imagine for a moment if the bitter cold outside meant not just discomfort, but the very real threat of death from hunger and disease. The stories I'll share tonight aren't just tales. They're memories of hardship, desperation, and incredible resilience. So listen close and picture yourself in a world where each winter was a gamble with fate. Let's begin on a night much like this, but centuries ago, when the candles burned lower and the larders emptied far too soon. Across the fields and villages of Europe, winter could arrive not as a gently falling snow, but as a slow grinding disaster. The most dreaded of all was famine. When the cold lingered longer than expected, or the spring rains came too early and too heavy, the earth itself betrayed the people. Crops failed, seeds rotted where they were sown, and whole communities faced months with barely a crust to share. You might have heard whispers of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, an event so terrible that it etched itself into the bones and memories of all who survived. Picture it. The spring was not gentle, but sodden and chill. Barley and wheat, usually the promise of future bread, never sprouted. Then came another year, and another. In England, the price of a simple loaf of bread soared to 20 times its normal cost. The poor, with nothing left to sell or trade, turned to the wild. They dug for roots, gnawed on bitter grass, and stripped bark from trees just to quiet the gnawing in their bellies. Desperation knows no bounds. Some scavenged for scraps in places the living ought never to go. There were stories, grim ones, of people digging up graves, driven by hunger so sharp they could not tell the difference between right and wrong, between the living and the dead. In cities like Ypres and Bruges, in what is now Belgium, somewhere between 10 and 25% of the people perished during those famine years. That's not just numbers, that's entire streets, whole families, gone. In the French town of Tournai, a citizen kept a diary, his entries growing more frantic with each passing week. He wrote of neighbors forced to eat dogs, horses, and whatever else they could find, things once considered unclean and unthinkable. You can almost hear the despair in his words, the growing sense that civilization itself was slipping away. And as hunger gnawed at the body, so too did it gnaw at the soul. Crime rose. Thieves and beggars became bolder as honest work disappeared. People stole not for greed, but for survival. One story, found in the Chronicles of St. Mary's Abbey, tells of a woman caught stealing bread. She was pregnant, and her body wasted by starvation. The baker, just as desperate, would show no mercy. The judges, unmoved, condemned her. She was hanged in the square. As she died, her child was born, falling bloody and crying onto the frozen ground. The crowd looked on, paralyzed by fear and horror, and no one stepped forward. The baby's cries faded, and soon there was only silence. I ask you, can you fathom such helplessness? When the weather finally changed in 1318, bringing sun and warmth and a promise of new crops, relief swept through the countryside. Yet the memory of starvation lingered, carved into every empty stomach and every haunted face. Each following winter, people eyed their dwindling stores with dread, praying for mercy, hoping that the spectre of famine would pass them by. But hunger was not the only enemy. Malnutrition left people weak, their bodies unable to fight off disease. And winter, with its cramped, smoky rooms and little chance to escape the chill, was the perfect breeding ground for illness. Imagine an entire family huddled close around a single hearth, coughing in the thick air. The windows shuttered tight against the cold. Influenza, dysentery, pneumonia. These names were not just whispers of discomfort, but harbingers of death. A simple winter cold, the kind you or I might shrug off with a mug of broth and a day in bed, could prove fatal. The healers of the age, with no knowledge of germs, treated the sick with bleeding and purges, hoping to balance the body's humors. More often than not, these remedies only made matters worse. Even the mighty were not spared. Charlemagne himself, the great emperor, was felled by a fever in the bitter winter of 814. His doctors, armed with poultices and prayers, could do nothing as he faded away. Disease didn't just take individuals, it swept through communities like wildfire. The Black Death, which struck in 1348 and 1349, found easy victims among the malnourished and the crowded. It's hard to grasp the scale of that calamity. Imagine half the people you know, gone in the space of a year. In some places, the death toll reached 60%. Streets emptied, shops shuttered, and the only sounds were the keening of mourners and the tolling of funeral bells. There's a letter from Pistoia, Italy, written by Ser Luca to his brother Franceschino. He writes, "I am sick at heart and can barely bring myself to write, for things here go from bad to worse. Many are dead, and many more are dying. Shops are closed, taverns deserted. One passes down streets without meeting a soul. Wails of grief echo from houses where death has struck. The stench of rot rises from mass graves. I fear our city may soon be empty of life entirely. I beg you, stay where you are and pray for us unceasingly." Reading those words, you can feel the weight of despair, the sense of a world coming undone. With death everywhere, even the rituals of mourning became impossible. In the depths of winter, the ground was often too hard to dig, and bodies were piled up in mass graves or left in the snow, shunned by the living for fear of contagion. Those who survived were left with scars deeper than any frostbite, the trauma of loss, the memory of streets filled with the cries of the dying. The most vulnerable suffered first and suffered most. The very old, the very young, and mothers expecting children faced the greatest peril. Without our modern medicine, without warm nurseries or reliable nutrition, infants died by the dozens. In some societies, as many as 30% of babies never saw their first spring, many lost during the harshest months. Mothers, already weakened by hunger, often died in childbirth, their bodies unable to bear the strain. One story that still chills the heart is that of young Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England. She was just 12 years old, pregnant, and returning to England aboard the White Ship in the winter of 1120. The ship struck a rock in the English Channel and began to sink. Matilda managed to climb into a rescue boat, clinging to hope. But when she saw her half-brother William struggling in the icy water, she begged the boatmen to turn back. In the chaos, too many desperate souls tried to clamber aboard, and the boat capsized. Matilda, her unborn child, and countless others were swallowed by the sea's freezing embrace. Her father, upon hearing of her death, was said to have collapsed in grief and never smiled again. The old and the young, if not felled by hunger or illness, sometimes simply froze to death in their sleep. There's a passage in the medieval poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, describing King Arthur himself shivering in his great hall, teeth chattering beneath his robes. Even in castles, the cold could be relentless. Imagine what it was like in a peasant's cottage, with only a thin wall between yourself and the howling wind. Nature, too, could turn violent without warning. Medieval winters brought not just snow, but wild storms and devastating floods. In 1216, King John of England, fleeing his enemies, attempted to cross the treacherous marshes of the Wash. A sudden tidal surge swept away his baggage train, along with the crown jewels. The king barely escaped with his life. Some say he never recovered from this loss, dying just days later, broken and defeated. Along the coasts, storms could batter entire towns into oblivion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a sea flood in 1099 that swept across England, drowning villages and leaving countless dead. The Netherlands, too, suffered a great flood in 1219 when the North Sea surged inland and 50,000 souls were lost in a single night. There were no warnings, no rescue teams, just the prayers of the desperate as the wind screamed and the waters rose. Fire, ironically, was another winter terror. People crowded around hearths and candles, seeking warmth, but a single spark could ignite disaster. In 1132, a dreadful fire tore through London, leaping from roof to roof on the wings of a winter gale. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Cathedral of Canterbury, and countless homes were reduced to ashes. People fled through narrow lanes, clutching their children, while flames consumed all behind them. With most buildings made of wood and packed tightly together, the city was a tinderbox. There was little anyone could do but throw water or snow on the flames and hope the wind would turn. In these moments, prayer became the last refuge. With so much beyond their control, medieval people turned to faith, begging for deliverance from hunger, sickness, fire, and floods. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. Yet even as the world darkened, the hope for a better season never fully died. So as you sit here, warmed by the glow of the fire and the comfort of good company, take a moment to imagine life without these blessings. If you've ever known hardship or witnessed the power of nature, share your story in the comments. Let us remember together those who came before and the ways they endured. Their struggles, though marked by tragedy, laid the foundation for the resilience and spirit that still inspire us today. But perhaps the greatest danger of medieval winter was something that required no great blizzards, floods, or conflagrations. In the next chapter, we'll look beyond disaster to the quiet endurance and hope that carried people through the darkest months. So refill your cup, settle in, and let's journey onward through winter's long night. Now, come in and settle yourself beside the fire, my friend. Let the warmth seep into your bones as the storm rattles the shutters. I'll pour you a mug of spiced ale, and together, let's slip back in time to a world where winter was not just a season, it was a test of the very soul. The dangers of medieval winter weren't always the grand disasters, you see. No, not always the howling blizzards or rivers surging over their banks. Sometimes, the greatest threat was simply the relentless, bone-deep cold, a chill that crept through every crack in the wall, that wormed its way under every layer, and never quite let go. If you close your eyes, you might imagine it now. No central heating humming in the background, no soft fleece to wrap around your shoulders. Just a drafty hall, a battered hearth, and a fire that never quite burned hot enough. The cold was a cunning enemy, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. It whispered through the stones, soaked into the straw, and made every joint ache with the promise of another long night. Imagine waking in the pre-dawn darkness, breath turning to mist in the air above your palate. You tug another scratchy blanket closer, but it barely helps. Even the fires, fed with damp wood and guarded jealously, do little more than spit smoke and cast flickering shadows. The air stings, biting at fingers and toes until they tingle and go numb. For many, especially the old and the frail, winter was a time of dread. Each morning, you might wonder if the sun would ever rise warm again. The pain of cold was everywhere. Arthritis gnawed at the joints of elders, the ache swelling with each passing year. Fingers and noses, left uncovered for a moment too long, grew stiff and pale, sometimes darkening with frostbite's cruel kiss. Illnesses like pneumonia and influenza flourished in the crowded, smoky interiors. You'd hear it at night, the rasping coughs, the soft moans, the breaths that rattled like dried leaves. The cold seemed to seep right through skin and sinew, deep into the chest, squeezing the very breath from your lungs. A monk named Gildas, writing in Britain well over 1,000 years ago, captured the feeling in words that sting even now. The nights are long and dark, the days dreary and chill. The air bites with malice, the icy blasts cut to the bone. All is blanketed in snow and frost. It is a time of great suffering for man and beast alike. You can almost hear his despair echoing across the centuries, a sense that the earth itself had surrendered to winter's iron grip. For some, it felt as if hope itself had frozen. Especially for those who had seen too many winters, the cold became a shadow in the soul. People layered on every scrap of wool and fur they owned, huddling together in shared beds or pressed tight on benches. Still, the cold found its way in. Fires sputtered, choking the room with smoke that stung your eyes and scraped your throat raw. Sometimes, the only sound was the hacking of coughs and the steady drip of water melting from the rafters. There was no escape, no handy solution, no holidays to sunny shores, no soft electric blankets to banish the nighttime chill. Winter was an uninvited, unyielding guest. It drained your strength, made every daily task a struggle. It's no wonder, really, that medieval folk measured their lives not by the years, but by the winters survived. To greet another spring was a victory worth celebrating, a hard-won triumph over darkness and cold. Let me ask you, have you ever counted the winters of your own life? Imagine measuring time not by birthdays, but by the number of times you've watched the world thaw from ice to green. For our medieval ancestors, each spring felt like a miracle, and each winter survived was a mark of courage. Yet, for all these hardships, there was a light that never quite died. Against the odds, against the gnawing hunger, the sickness, the numbing cold, people endured. They found ways to press on, year after year, winter after winter, armed with little more than stubborn hope and the strength of their will. When food ran low, they rationed every crumb and tightened their belts another notch. When the fire was down to its last ember, they huddled closer and wrapped themselves in whatever rags they could find. When darkness pressed in, they whispered stories to one another, tales of lands where the sun always shone and the fields ripened with grain. There's a line from a 14th century poem that always comes to mind when I think of those days. Through woe and winter's bale, frost and snow and sleet and hail, all shall pass and peace prevail. Hope shall triumph and never fail. Isn't that a beautiful thought? Even with the world frozen around them, they believed in the coming of peace, in the promise that winter's hold would someday break. And even in the bitterest cold, small kindnesses warmed the heart. Neighbors shared what little they had, offering a bowl of broth or a handful of grain to those in greater need. In the flickering light of the evening, voices joined together in song and prayer, sometimes so softly that only the angels could hear. Some swore that, if you listened closely, the wind itself carried the promise of spring, a whisper that warmth and sunlight would return. So the people of the Middle Ages clung to hope, sometimes with white-knuckled determination. They kept their gaze fixed on the distant horizon, knowing deep down that winter, no matter how long or harsh, was never forever. The sun would rise, the snow would melt, and the world would come alive again, just as it always had. All they needed was to endure, and endure they did, forging their resilience in the very ice and stone of the season. Every winter left them a bit tougher, a bit wiser, with a deep, abiding gratitude for the turning of the year. The medieval winter was a crucible, shaping people into survivors, strengthening communities, and teaching them the value of compassion and unity. Now, think for a moment about your own winter hardships. Maybe you grumble about scraping frost off your windshield, or about a chilly walk from the car to your door. Compared to what our ancestors faced, these are small trials, but the lesson is the same. For them, winter was a test of spirit, a season to be survived through grit, togetherness, and a hope that refused to die. And they did survive. They left us their stories, their songs, their hard-earned wisdom. They faced each winter with a mixture of dread and determination. And when the world thawed, they celebrated all the more fiercely. Their endurance is a lesson for us, a reminder that even in our darkest days, we are not alone, and that hope, however faint, can pull us through. So when you find yourself staring down your own hardships, remember those who came before. They faced storms that threatened to swallow them whole, buried loved ones in frozen ground, and still, somehow, found the faith to believe in spring. If they could make it through, with little more than a patchwork of furs and a stubborn will, surely we too can find our own strength to weather the storms in our lives. The winters of the Middle Ages are long gone, but their lessons linger on, echoing through the halls of time. They remind us that the coldest season is never the end, just another turning of the wheel. So, let's step forward with courage and kindness, holding tight to hope, just as they did. If those medieval folk could face the bleakest winter with their heads held high, then so can we. Winter will always come, but spring, spring is never far behind. And as the wind rattles the shutters and the night deepens, let's carry that spirit with us, my friend. For the next part of our journey, we'll draw even closer to the warmth of the hearth and explore how medieval life shone with resilience and togetherness, even in the heart of winter's darkness. As the chilling winds howled across the frozen landscape, medieval folks gathered around the flickering light of the hearth fire. Lean in closer to the fire, friend, and let the warmth chase away the chill that creeps along the floorboards. Here by the hearth, the company is good, and the stories are better. Tonight, let me take you back to a winter long ago, a season when snow blanketed the world, and every breath hung heavy in the icy air. Picture yourself nestled among your kin in a humble cottage, the walls shuddering with each gust, the roof groaning under a weight of frost. Whether you imagine the rough timber walls of a peasant's hut, or the soaring stone halls of a noble manor, winter showed little mercy to any soul. As the days grew shorter and darkness claimed the hours, everyone drew close to the flames for comfort. The fire's glow danced in the eyes of the old and young alike, casting flickering shadows on faces etched with the hardships of the season. In these moments, stories of winter's past were passed around like cups of hot broth, each tale a reminder of how the cold shapes both body and spirit. The icy wind outside was a great equalizer. Even the grandest lord, swathed in velvet and fur, felt the ache in his bones. His hearth might roar with oak logs, tended by tireless servants, yet he too dreaded venturing too far from its golden glow. For beneath the banners and finery, winter's bite found every crack in the stonework, every gap beneath the door. Now, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the grumble of a peasant family as they huddle together for warmth. The walls of their home are little more than sticks and mud, patched with whatever scraps could be scavenged. The thatched roof does its best to keep out the snow, but the wind still sneaks through, chilling the air and carrying with it the smell of damp earth and old smoke. Fuel is precious, every stick of wood or peat a treasure. The hearth sputters and coughs, a thin wisp of smoke filling the cramped room. There is no privacy here. Children, parents, and grandparents all share the same small space, pressed together beneath threadbare blankets. The air grows heavy, thick with the scent of sweat and the unwashed, an honest reminder of the season's hardships. Yet, despite it all, there are moments when laughter bubbles up, irrepressible and bright. In the village square, the communal fire becomes a beacon. Even the most stoic farmer is drawn out, if only for a while. Picture the villagers gathered around the flames, cheeks red from the cold, eyes sparkling as stories fly, and old songs rise into the night. A neighbor cracks a joke, another bursts into song, and for a fleeting moment, the world feels lighter. The worries of empty bellies and howling winds are pushed aside by the warmth of community. Young couples steal a shy glance. hands brushing as they inch closer to the blaze. Children, wild with energy, chase each other across the frozen ground, shrieking with delight as they slip and tumble. Even the elders, usually so weighed down by aches and cares, find themselves grinning, remembering winters gone by when they too were fleet-footed and carefree. It's easy to forget, as you sit in your modern home with the hum of heating and the steady glow of electric lights, just how rare and precious these moments of joy were. Winter in the Middle Ages was relentless. Food stores dwindled with each passing week, and the gnawing edge of hunger was never far away, especially for the poor. The fields lay frozen beneath a thick quilt of snow, and the promise of spring's bounty seemed like a distant dream. At night, as stomachs rumbled, thoughts turned to the uncertainty of survival. A single failed harvest could mean disaster for an entire village. Mothers watched anxiously as their children grew thin, cheeks hollow, and eyes wide with hunger. The fear of famine haunted every fireside conversation, a shadow that lingered even amidst laughter. Scarcity bred desperation. There were stories, whispered on long winter nights, of those driven to unspeakable acts by hunger. Such tales served as grim warnings, reminders of how thin the line was between survival and ruin. But hunger was not the only enemy lurking in the cold. Illness swept through the villages with the chill. Listen, and you can hear the hacking coughs of pneumonia echoing through the rafters, the wheezing breaths of the old and the very young. Sickness showed no mercy. The pox and the flux, diseases we barely think of now, ravaged families, stealing away the vulnerable. For many, the winter months brought a constant vigil, tending to feverish loved ones and praying for strength to see the family through. Outside, the world was even harsher. Imagine braving a journey in such weather. Whether you were a humble peddler or a noble knight, the risks were the same. Icy roads could swallow travelers in snowdrifts, or send them skidding off into the darkness. Many who set out never returned, their fates discovered only when the spring thaw revealed what the snows had hidden. Even the proudest warriors, clad in armor, found their strength sapped by the cold. Frozen metal bit into fingers, making every movement clumsy. Horses, those great companions of knight and farmer alike, struggled through drifts, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Winter spared no one, not even those who wore crowns. Kings and queens fretted in their grand halls, their worries piled high like logs beside the fire. The cost of feeding a royal court, keeping the stores filled and the hearths burning, could empty a treasury. Merchants grew rich selling firewood and provisions, while the common folk scraped by on what little they could glean. And yet, even in the shadow of hardship, hope managed to bloom. There were days when joy triumphed over the cold. Think of the Feast of Stephen, when for a single day the ordinary order of things was overturned. The peasant might don a lord's mantle, laughter and mischief replacing the usual cares. Revelry filled the halls, songs rang out, and for a brief shining moment the world felt turned on its head. Drunken merriment and bawdy jokes filled the air, and the harshness of winter faded into the background. Laughter echoed through the land, a balm for the soul that lifted everyone's spirits. Even the sternest elders found themselves swept up in the joy, forgetting their worries as they joined in the song. As the weeks crept on, the grip of winter slowly began to loosen. Icicles dripped from the rooftops, each drop a promise of warmer days. The sun, growing stronger, coaxed the first brave snowdrops and crocuses from the thawing ground. These tiny flowers, delicate but determined, announced that winter's reign was ending. The land began to stir, the soil softening, the air sweetening with the scent of new life. People looked to the coming of spring, with hope swelling in their chests. The Feast of the Plough marked this turning point. Villagers gathered to celebrate the return of the sun and the promise of planting. Oxen, sleek and eager, pulled new ploughs through the dark, rich earth. The fields, once barren and white, would soon ripple with green shoots and the golden promise of harvest. Before long, the memories of winter's hardships grew hazy, softened by the warmth and abundance of the new season. But the lessons endured. The people who survived those long, bitter months did so because they were bound together, by necessity, by love, by hope. Their resilience, their willingness to share both suffering and joy, became their greatest strength. It's a lesson worth remembering, even now. When you're tempted to grumble about icy sidewalks or a late train, think of those who faced winters with far less, and yet found ways to endure, to laugh, and to hope. So tonight, as the fire burns low and we ready ourselves for sleep, let's pause for a moment of gratitude. The warmth of a safe home, a full belly, and the company of friends is a blessing our medieval forebears would have cherished above all else. Perhaps, in your dreams, you'll wander those snowy fields, feeling the sting of the wind and the comfort of a shared hearth. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry a bit of their indomitable spirit with you into the waking world. If these stories spark any memories or thoughts of your own, I'd love to hear them down in the comments. Share your reflections, and together we'll keep this fireside community alive. As the embers glow and the night deepens, let's turn our attention to the hardest test of all. The true struggle of medieval winter survival was just beginning, for tomorrow brings us back to the frozen fields, where the poor and weary must find a way to endure. The bitter chill of winter descended upon medieval Europe, and for peasants scraping out a meager living from the soil, warmth and light seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep, aching cold that penetrated to the bone. Here, my friend, come closer to the hearth and settle in. You can feel the fire's warmth against your skin, a comfort so precious in the dead of a medieval winter. Now, imagine yourself in those frostbitten centuries past, when winter arrived, not just as a season, but as a true test of endurance for everyone living in these lands. The wind outside rattles the shutters, and the darkness stretches long and deep, pressing in on every side, as if the world itself has shrunk to the small flickering circle of your fire. For the poor peasant families living then, winter was a harsh and hungry guest, one that refused to leave. Think for a moment about waking up in a one-room hut, your breath rising in clouds before your face, because the cold has crept in everywhere. The walls are little more than woven sticks stored with mud, barely holding back the biting wind. Your threadbare tunic and patched cloak offer scant protection, and the thin straw mattress beneath you is no match for the chill that seeps up from the frozen earth. Food is always on your mind, and not because you have a pantry to browse. With the harvest long gone, the cellar might hold only a few wrinkled turnips, a sack of barley, and some salted pork if your family was lucky that year. Each meal is carefully measured, every crust of bread and mouthful of broth a calculation in survival. You eat by the dim light of a tallow candle, the air thick with the smells of smoke, damp earth, and the ever-present barnyard aroma drifting from the animals, sharing your living space. It might not sound pleasant, but their body heat is sometimes all that stands between your family and the deadly cold. Huddled together, parents, children, and livestock alike, you find what comfort you can in shared warmth, even as the air grows heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and animal sweat. Coughs echo through the night, and fevers run unchecked. Illness spreads quickly in the cramped, damp quarters, where the only medicine is a prayer, and perhaps a little dried herb from last summer's garden. You lie awake listening to the wind howling outside, wondering if your family will see the spring. Every winter, it was a miracle that anyone survived. Yet, let's not imagine that the nobles fared much better, at least when it came to escaping the cold. Step for a moment into the echoing halls of a stone castle. The walls are thick and draughty, and the tapestries flutter with every gust that sneaks through cracks in the masonry. Even with roaring fires blazing in the great hearths, the warmth never seems to reach your toes. The stone floors are icy, and the air itself seems to bite. Imagine wrapping yourself in heavy furs, layering woolen robes, and yet still feeling the cold creeping under your skin. History offers up stories that show just how merciless winter could be, even for royalty. There's a tale, whispered in the shadowy corners of the court, about Queen Elizabeth Woodville, wife to King Edward IV of England. They say that one especially brutal night in the 15th century, she went to bed swaddled in her finest robes and furs, only to be found in the morning, stiff and cold, lost to the night's chill. Was it truly the cold that claimed her, or just a legend grown in the telling? No one can say for certain, but the story lingers, a reminder that no amount of privilege could command the winter to show mercy. Kings and queens could fill their tables with roasted meats and red wine, but they still shivered in their grand chambers. The cold was an equalizer. Slipping past velvet curtains and gold-embroidered blankets just as easily as it did through the broken shutters of a peasant's hut. No one, not even the highest born, could hold back the darkness and the cold for long. As the days shrank and the nights stretched on endlessly, all of medieval society prepared itself for the long and brutal siege of winter. Every household, from the smallest cottage to the grandest manor, checked and rechecked their stores of food and firewood. People wrapped themselves in every scrap of wool and fur they owned. It was a time for careful rationing and for stoic endurance. The knowledge that the only way out was to simply keep going, no matter how hard the cold pressed in. But there was a flicker of hope, a bright spot in the endless dark. Around Christmastide, the whole village would come alive with anticipation. The Feast of St. Stephen on December 26 brought a burst of colour and laughter that stood out against the greyness of winter. For a few days, the world turned upside down. Imagine the scene: a lord of misrule, chosen from among the peasants, suddenly given power to command the revels. He might be a young farmhand, his cheeks flushed with excitement and the press of the crowd, issuing ridiculous orders and grand proclamations, just for the joy of seeing everyone laugh. Noble and commoner alike would gather in the hall, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat, spiced wine, and sweat. The tables groaned under the weight of what little food could be spared: pies, breads, even a special treat or two saved for just such a day. The music started up, reed pipes and fiddles setting a wild rhythm. People danced and sang, their faces glowing in the firelight, shaking off the winter's gloom, if only for a night. This was a rare moment when the usual rules faded away. For a little while, all were equal in their celebration. The Lord of Misrule might order a noblewoman to fetch him ale, or command a grizzled old shepherd to lead a silly dance. Laughter echoed off the stone walls, and the burdens of class and hardship melted into shared merriment. It was a welcome release, a necessary rebellion against the monotony and misery of the season. Yet, as quickly as it began, the celebrations faded. The last cup was drained, the fires burned down to embers, and the Lord of Misrule put aside his makeshift crown. People drifted back to their own hearths, the cold waiting for them on the threshold. The joy of the feast was just a brief respite. Soon enough, the grim routine resumed. Winter held them fast in its icy grip, and there was nothing for it but to endure. The weeks that followed seemed to stretch on forever. The fields outside lay frozen and silent, the earth itself hard as iron. There was no work to be done, no seed to sow or crop to tend. Families huddled indoors, spinning tales and dreams to pass the endless nights. The world outside felt lifeless, and the hope of spring seemed impossibly far away. You can picture it, can't you? The darkness pressing in, time slowing to a crawl, and the constant hunger gnawing at your belly. Yet, somewhere beneath the frozen ground, life waited. Tiny green shoots, hidden and patient, gathered their strength for the day they could push up toward the sun. Even in the blackest days of winter, Hope was never entirely extinguished. When the thaw finally came, it was as if the world itself exhaled. Slowly, the snow melted from the fields, and the air grew softer. On Plough Monday, just after Epiphany, the people would step out into the pale new light. Lean, tired, but alive, they would take up the tools of their trade and begin again. The soil was turned, the seeds planted, and the flocks led out to the pasture. The great wheel of the year moved forward, and life, in all its stubborn beauty, resumed its dance. But in that bleakest stretch, as winter's heart beat on, what kept people going wasn't just the hope of bread or sun. It was each other. In those smoky hovels and stone halls, rough woolen cloaks pulled tight, neighbors and families found strength in their shared struggle. They gathered close, not just for warmth, but for comfort. For every story told, every song sung, and every smile shared was a small act of resistance against the season's cruelty. No matter how fierce the cold, or how long the night, they endured. Lords and peasants, children and elders alike, all waited beneath the same steely sky, longing for the promise of spring. They listened to the wind batter the doors, and the ice groan in the rafters, spinning their hopes and memories into the fabric of the night. And who knows what they dreamed of during those long hours? Perhaps a kinder world, where winters were gentler and hunger less sharp. Or maybe they simply clung to the small moments of laughter and light, trusting that as surely as winter comes, so too does the thaw. The human spirit, it seems, carries a spark that no amount of cold can fully snuff out. So tonight, as you wrap yourself in a warm blanket and settle into your bed, take a moment to reflect. Think of those who came before us, facing winters without our modern comforts, no central heating, no electric lights, and certainly no grocery deliveries on demand. Their strength and perseverance are nothing short of remarkable. Perhaps, in our own lives, we can keep a piece of that same resilience burning, no matter what storms we face. Let's lift a silent toast to those long ago men and women who endured so much, yet still found reasons to hope. In a world that often seemed cold and uncertain, the fire of their endurance still glows, passed down through ages, warming our own nights. As the embers glow low in the hearth, remember that even the darkest winter eventually yields to the coming of spring. And so, our story turns to the celebrations, resilience, and the burst of hope that comes with winter's end. As the long winter months dragged on, medieval folk looked forward to any opportunity to lift their spirits and foster a sense of community and goodwill amidst the hardships. Picture yourself now, seated here by my hearth. Imagine the stone walls frosted with chill, the wind rattling the shutters, and yet, inside, every face is turned toward the promise of celebration. One such beacon in the heart of winter's gloom was the Feast of St. Stephen, which fell on December the 26th, just after Christmas. By the time of the Middle Ages, this day had blossomed into a beloved tradition, a much-needed break in the unyielding march of winter. On St. Stephen's Day, the tone shifted from solemnity to joy. After the sacred hush of Christmas, the people longed for laughter, connection, and a bit of mischief to shake loose the weight of the season. The centerpiece was the custom of misrule, a topsy-turvy day where a peasant or commoner was chosen as the lord of misrule, granted the power to command even the highest in the land, if only for a few hours. Imagine the thrill in the air as the chosen lord, crowned with holly and ribbons, led a raucous parade through the village lanes, his commands sparking giggles and good-natured groans from both lords and labourers alike. For a brief, shining day, the rigid social order melted away like frost before the sun. The lord of misrule might decree that the local lord sing a bawdy song, or that the village priest join a clumsy dance. Laughter rang out as villagers, young and old, joined the procession, masks and painted faces lending everyone a sense of freedom and playful anonymity. Minstrels tuned their lutes and struck up lively tunes, while jugglers tossed apples and torches, their feats earning gasps and applause. Imagine the bright colors of the costumes and banners, a vivid contrast to the gray and white of the winter landscape outside. No one was left out. Games of chance, dice and cards drew competitive shouts from the crowd, and the echoes of wooden balls clattering across stone floors marked games of skittles or bowls. Mummers, those traveling players with painted faces, performed broad comic sketches drawn from legend and folktale, their exaggerated antics sending peals of laughter through the crowd. In some households, mock jousts unfolded, broomsticks for lances and pillows for armor, as the knights tumbled over each other to the delight of onlookers. It was a day when the ordinary cares of life, empty pantries, frozen fingers, aching backs, could be set aside. The spirit of the feast was generosity. The lord of misrule could demand that the wealthy open their larders, sharing food and drink with everyone, no matter their standing. Picture the long tables groaning under the weight of roasted geese, capons, and sometimes even a grand boar's head, carried in with pomp and song. Minced pies bursting with dried fruits and fragrant spices added sweetness to the meal, and the wassail bowl, filled with warm spiced cider, made its rounds, shared from hand to hand, warming cold fingers and tired hearts alike. Take a moment to imagine the aroma, a blend of roasting meat, cloves, cinnamon, and the piney tang of the boughs decorating the hall. The air inside buzzed with chatter and laughter, while outside, the wind howled and the snow pressed against the doors. For that one night, the hardships of medieval winter faded into the background, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared joy. As the revels wound down and the singing gave way to quieter conversation, families bundled up and made their way home, lanterns flickering in the darkness. Yet, the warmth of the day lingered, a flicker of firelight inside each heart, a reminder that even the hardest winter could not fully douse the flame of community spirit. The knowledge that friends and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, that laughter could still echo through stone halls, even as the world outside lay frozen, helped carry them through the weeks yet to come. You can almost hear the last strains of song drifting through the night air, mingling with the crackle of logs on the fire. And when the final embers faded, the memory of St. Stephen's feast would remain, an ember to be kindled again when spirits began to flag. As the days inched forward and the sun lingered a little longer on the horizon, villagers watched for the first signs that winter's grip was loosening. Snowdrops, those delicate, brave flowers, were often the first to push through the receding snow. Tiny spears of green tipped with white, defying the lingering frost. Their appearance was met with quiet wonder and soft exclamations, a signal that spring, though still far off, was stirring beneath the frozen ground. Picture a village child kneeling in the slush, eyes wide with delight as the first snowdrop blooms appear along the hedge. The elders smile knowingly, remembering winters past when the sight of those fragile blossoms gave hope to the weary. Their arrival meant that the endless waiting was almost over, and the land, silent for so long, was ready to awaken. With hope renewed, life began to stir again. The wheel of the year turned, and the rhythms of the countryside shifted from survival to renewal. Livestock, huddled in barns for months, were led out onto pastures slowly tinting green. The farmer, stiff and sore from winter's idleness, hitched up his team and set his hand to the plow, eager to feel the earth yield beneath the blade. Do you see it? On the first Monday after Epiphany, Plough Monday, the entire village gathered for a procession. The ploughs decorated with ribbons and garlands, blessed with prayers for a fruitful year. Children tagged along, their cheeks rosy, while ploughmen visited each house, collecting gifts of bread, ale, and coins, all in the spirit of hope and anticipation. This ritual not only marked the return of work, but also the return of life's promise. Imagine a huddle of neighbors around the edge of the field, faces turned up to the sky, watching clouds drift across a paler, friendlier blue. The old grandmother kneels in the softening earth, a child on each side, guiding small hands as they press peas into the soil. One child giggles as a fat earthworm squirms away. The other solemnly pats the dirt, both learning the rhythms of renewal passed down through generations. Here, in these simple acts, wisdom and love are sown alongside the seeds. It's easy to forget, as we settle under our modern blankets and reach for the thermostat, just how hard-won these moments of hope were. For medieval folk, surviving to see another spring was an accomplishment worth celebrating. They had no central heating, no electric lights, no endless supermarkets to fill their stores. Every winter was a test, and every sign of spring a victory. Yet even in the hardest times, they found ways to lift each other up. Through feasts, laughter, shared work, and gentle ritual, they transformed hardship into resilience and darkness into hope. Their secret was not just endurance, but a willingness to find light in fellowship, and to trust that spring would always return, no matter how deep the cold. So tonight, as you sit by my fire, let your mind wander back to those distant days, to the laughter in the great hall, the hush over a snowy field, the feeling of cold earth between your fingers as you plant a new season's hope. What do you think you would have cherished most on those long, dark nights? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What small comforts or rituals help you through the winter? And if you've enjoyed this journey through medieval winters, do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here by the hearth, there will always be more stories to warm your evenings and spark your dreams. As the fire dies down and the wind hums gently outside, know that, like our ancestors, we carry within us the same spark, the same hope that spring will come again. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, wrapped in your own circle of warmth, remember those who came before us, and let that courage kindle your spirit. May your dreams be filled with the laughter of old feasts, the promise of green shoots, and the comfort of a community that endures through every winter. Good night, friend. Until we meet again by the hearth.